Mario Pecheny obtained a PhD in political sciences from the University of Paris III. He is full professor of sociology of health and political sciences at the University of Buenos Aires. He is also principal investigator of CONICET at the Germany Institute, University of Buenos Aires. Currently, he is vice president of scientific affairs of CONICET. Research programs led by Mario are focused on human rights and politics with regard to health, gender, and sexuality. He wrote and edited several books devoted to extremely sensitive social topics linked to vulnerable sexual minorities and their identities, particularly in Latin America. Because of his social commitment and exceptionally valuable work, Mario has been awarded with several prizes, including the Hughes Prize in Social Sciences from the Ministry of Science and Technology of Argentina. He was also appointed visiting professor at several universities, including the University of Columbia, Michigan, Paris III, Rio de Janeiro, Santa Catarina, Lima, Cape City, and others. The title of Mario's talk today will be Gender is not just a term in grammar. Structural inequalities and anti-discrimination policies within the scientific sector in Argentina. So thank you very much. And thank you very much, Mario and Belen, for your talks.
Well, thank you. I would like to thank particularly Alberto Kornblit, who invited me to be with you today. My talk is about gender is not just a term in grammar, structural inequalities and anti-discrimination policies within the scientific sector in Argentina. My name is Mario Pecheny, and I work at the University of Buenos Aires and CONICET. My point of departure. Within the scientific sector in Argentina, gender gaps are systematic. Structures, processes, and instruments that determine gender inequalities are both external and internal to the scientific sector. Inaction and gender-blind rules are not neutral. In other words, current structures, processes, and instruments not only they don't avoid gender inequalities, but they produce those gender inequalities. Of course, cultural social changes are necessary, but we also need institutional measures, and I will focus on that. Some background. Legal framework in Argentina is quite favorable to gender equity. We have several laws and policies on reproductive rights, non-discrimination, gender-based violence. We have gender quotas and parity in political representation. And since 2010, Argentina approved gay and lesbian marriage, and in 2012, a very progressive transgender identity rights law. Since 2018, a law called Micaela states that mandatory training on gender for every public officer and employee, including public organisms like CONICET. The CONICET, as you might know, is the National Scientific and Technical Research Council. It includes areas of knowledge, all areas of knowledge, biomedical, natural and formal sciences, engineering and technology, and social sciences and humanities. 11,000 full-time researchers and more than 12,000 scholarships for PhD and postdoc students from the community that I will talk about in this presentation. The composition of CONICET. Women account for half of the staff of researchers in the organism. In 2010, a little bit less than 50%, and in 2019, a little bit more than 50%. However, at the initial category, women are 61%, but in the highest category, only 24.5% are women. And if we control by age, this gender bias still works. I will show the following tables only for the record, not to go into details, but we can see here the numbers on the category and now the age and the generation. Also, we record differences according to areas and disciplines. In most areas, there are more women than men. in the three main areas, biomedical, engineering, and the social sciences, women are more than men. And in most disciplines, for example, anthropology, biotechnology, psychology, education, or medicine. And there are less women only in the area of natural sciences and formal sciences, and in some disciplines like physics, informatics, or economics. These are also, for the record, the disaggregation of data, just to be here in the presentation if someone wants to look after that. I will show some data that, in my view, are very interesting. That is data on gender gaps in publications. The average number of papers published per researcher and the average number of papers and books published in English or outside Latin America per researcher, both are indicators of internationalization. And particularly in the natural and biomedical sciences, we can see clear gender gaps in these indicators. For example, the average number of papers published by men and by women, women publish in average 28 papers and men publish in average 37 papers in CONICET. And also publications published in English, that, as I said, is an indicator of internationalization. Women publish 18.5% pieces in average, and men publish 25.4 publications in average. Here, I cannot see because of it's covered with my own photo, the last column, but in biomedical and natural sciences, women publish less than men in average. For example, biomedical, that I can see, 31.6 pieces in average against 46.5 for men. And this is the number of the publication rate in general. And in English, we see 23 against 32. In the social science, that we publish much less than you. The average for women is 4.5 and men is 6.5 publications in English. This figure shows the more disaggregate way the articles published in Europe, United States, and Latin America, and we see particularly in the internationalization gender gaps here materialized in the numbers of articles and books published. In some, there are more women at the base of the pyramid, and there are more men at the top. There are deficits in some particular areas and disciplines, and we recorded gaps in numbers of publications and in number of international publications in English or in American or European journals. Problems and possible explanations. As I said in the title, gender is not just a term in grammar, we all know that. But the question is, I can see now my own screen. Through which processes and instruments specific to the scientific field, women and other gender subjects are systematically discriminated against. Some examples. Indicators used to evaluate performance and productivity are constructed regardless of biographical events. Gender bias related to reproduction and care, for example. But there is an issue if we want to include or not that relevant personal information in CVs and resumes, because it can raise issues of stigma and issues of privacy. Other questions is the well-known sexual division of activities within the scientific sector. For example, the participation in evaluating committees. Some data show that women are participate more than men, or in undergrad teaching, or tasks performed in laboratories, or the order or in authorship. In general, we see that the subordinate or less important activities within the scientific practice are feminized, and the more privileged activities are overrepresented by men. Forms of gender, the other problems are forms of gender-based violence and sexual harassment in the scientific and higher education sectors. CONICET recorded large number of gender-based violence cases in all regions of the country and in all institutional settings. And the problem is we have difficulties to implement immediate institutional responses to protect victims and to separate aggressors. In general, responses are often on a case-by-case basis, but structural mechanisms remain intact. We still have a naturalization of gender violence and gender and generation inequalities. My question, or one of the questions, is in which specific aspects structural gender inequalities materialize in performance and evaluation within the scientific sector? That is, for example, to ask how the sexual division of care and domestic work impact on productivity and as a result on the evaluation and the possibility to advance in a scientific career. And also we have to study the specific dynamics and interactions, for example, between reproductive practices, to be pregnant, to have an abortion, to raise children, and the scientific work and career. In both directions, in general, we study more the impact on maternity, on performance, but not the needs and expectations for a scientific career. How do those factors impact in the decisions and practices related to the personal life? The actions we have taken, the CONICET has created an observatory of gender-based violence and violence at the workplace. They developed protocols and guidelines. They have created spaces of counseling and reception of complaints in different regions of the country. They produce materials to sensitize and to explain how to proceed in case of problems. And under that law, Micaela, there are several seminars and training to sensitize from the top to bottom or bottom to top in every institute on issues of gender. Also, the Ministry of Science has created this year a national program from gender equality in science, technology, and innovation. In progress, we have taken several small or big actions. For example, all male boards, scientific committees, organizing committees will not be funded or sponsored by CONICET. Gender equity is encouraged in every board and evaluation committee. And one special chapter for me is the recognition of transgender rights. That poses different problems for our everyday dynamic as a scientific institution. For example, the question of authorship, when they change their name according to the new gender identity, we need to update records, and the question of how to measure, citation, etc. And also the recognition of labor rights, like gender transition leaves. In the process of transitioning from one gender to another, they might need not to be at work or take time. Question of care is very important now at CONICET to study the integration of care practices and careers, the adaptation of maternity and paternity leaves to the specifics of the scientific work. It's not only maybe not go to work, but to adapt the schedules and the practices. Also, CONICET recognize maternity and paternity leaves for same-sex couples and gay and lesbian parents. And also we are studying some other care measures, for example, people caring of their elders or handicapped, etc. Some of the propositions is also to include gender-based violence leaves of work license, because there are special cases and protection within and outside the workplace. Sometimes the gender-based violence is not in the laboratory or the university, but at the home, but it has consequences for the everyday work as a scientist. One of the claims is the creation of kindergarten and protected spaces for breastfeeding in laboratories or near, to allow women to work while they have small babies. And we launched a new comparative research project on Argentina and Brazil scientific sectors to study gender inequality. This is a photograph of one of the first researchers openly transgender in CONICET. She works at the Atomic Center in Bariloche in the south of the country. So to conclude, gender policies within the scientific sector include extra-sector transformation of the patriarchal and hetero-cis-normative structures. Sorry about this hetero-cis-normative term, but I heard several terms from biology that for me sounds like, for you, might sound this long term. And intra-sector modification of gender-neutral instruments, procedures, and structures that produce gender inequalities, effective and comprehensive protection from gender-based violence and discrimination, positive discrimination and provision of institutional, that is legal and material resources, promotion of gender diversity and regulation of all maid panels and boards that still are very present, and further research and information of interactions between gender and sexuality. I didn't talk about that, but gender and sexuality and the scientific careers is needed. Why I titled my presentation just not the word in grammar? If gender is just a term in grammar, it comes from a song from a music from 1943, and it says, if gender is just a term in grammar, how can I ever find my way, since I'm a stranger here myself? Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. That was a really interesting talk. I think that the actions that CONICET is taking to improve gender inequalities are certainly very impressive. And while the audience questions are coming in, I want to ask you, are there any formal training programs established at CONICET for the benefit of the 11,000 employees so that they have a better understanding of these policies and these guidelines and why they're so important?
CONICET have started those programs very recently, and they are organizing now these pilot programs in different provinces. Imagine the CONICET is in all the country in hundreds of institutions, but they are developing tools now in the context of the epidemic, virtual tools, but also presence seminars, and they call sensitizing seminars to sensitize especially directors and advisors about those gender issues. But also, as I said, CONICET is studying institutional measures to make those changes in values possible to be practiced. Otherwise, it's impossible to, or very difficult for women or gay, lesbian, or transgender or younger generations to exercise their rights. But I think there are much movement within the institution now, and we are starting those processes now. But as I say, we need much more information about how, in concretely, those discrimination and violent practices impact and the possibilities to change cultural environments and labor environments that allow those practices. Otherwise, we resolve the case of the person or the team, but not the conditions that produce those unequal relations.
Yep, that makes sense. A question from Lou Sheffer. The differences in promotion seem much larger than the differences in paper publishing. And so Lou wants to know, are the promotion processes being, evaluated and possibly changed?
Yes, also we are studying how to do a fair process that might include the biographical, differences between men and women or whatever individual characteristic of your life has. But it's difficult. You cannot, measure, for example, number of children and number of papers. I don't know. But you have to include some measures to, for example, count productivity in the year when you have a child, and also create some, possibilities to qualify evaluation in terms of to be only quantitative. I think if we can go back to a more qualitative and more comprehensive evaluation of performance, might work better than the quantitative approach that we use and the standardized indicators that we use, because they are more, established and more easier to work with. But it's not an easy task. I think we are, I think not only in Argentina, we are all working on the COVID pandemic. There are several papers on the publication, and publication is related to promotion, because promotion sometimes is based on the number and the quality of your publication. So I think the whole evaluating system might be gendered, if I might say.
Sure, and one last question here. The National Ni Una Menos movement has been influential for gender violence in Argentina. Can you explain just briefly a little bit about this movement and whether or not it has influenced CONICET and the policies that you've been discussing?
This, not one less, this is a huge social movement with millions of women and not only women in the streets. It's like a sort of an equivalent, like a Me Too movement in the north. Also, it put the issue of gender-based violence in the agenda, not only of the country but in every institution. And I would say that in the creation of that movement, women researchers, and not only women from CONICET, they were very active. CONICET has been involved in several of the human rights, sexual rights, feminist rights, and LGBT rights in Argentina. So, in fact, the Ni Una Menos, not one less, and movement and CONICET are very, they interact, I would say, in a positive synergy. But this Ni Una Menos is much more related to femicides, to women and girls murdered or transgender murder. We are talking in the CONICET more subtle, but not complicated, but more not so tragic consequences of gender-based violence.
Sure, and related to that, does the scientific sector in general, or CONICET specifically, actively contribute to any social and political debates around gender?
Yes, I will mention two. In 2010, hundreds of researchers at CONICET published an endorsement of the gay and lesbian marriage, and it was very well received by the senators because they use as a, in quotation marks, scientific evidence that the gay and lesbian rights are human rights. And I say in quotation marks because, as you know, rights are not scientific, evidence-based, but it works as the evidence produced by research help the decision makers to make a decision. And in 2018, as Alberto Cornbit, you know him, and several other researchers, or Gabriel, we endorsed the project to legalize abortion. Abortion is still illegal in Argentina, and from the social sciences, biomedical sciences, we not, of course, the majority. We CONICET have citizens with all ideological and perspectives, but I think a big majority, we were very vocal endorsing the project to the bill to legalize abortion.
Thank you. I think we're going to end it here, but I want to take one last minute and again, thank you, Mario, and also thank you very much to Belen for sharing both of your work today. I want to thank the audience for joining us, and I want to encourage everyone to join us next week as we cross the pond to the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology, where we'll hear a science talk from Madeline Lancaster and a culture talk from Marianne Bienz. And that will be next Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time at the same link. And there were a lot of questions today. If you didn't have your questions answered, or if you want to engage with the speakers further, please go ahead and click the Slack link in the chat box and head over to Slack, and you can have further discussions. Thanks, everyone.